My name is James Anderson, and 2 years ago at my daughter's wedding, her husband called me a worthless immigrant loser. He said it with a smile, the kind that pretends to joke but bleeds contempt. What he didn't know was that the quiet man across from him owned 38 office buildings in downtown Austin, including the one where he worked. But I wasn't always a man people whispered about in Forbes articles. I came to America in 1983 with a duffel bag, a few $100s, and an accent thick enough to make waitresses lean closer and ask me to repeat myself. I remember stepping off that Greyhound bus into the Texas sun. The heat was like a wall. My boots were secondhand, and the soles flapped when I walked. But I was young, stubborn, and convinced that in this country, hard work would eventually shout louder than prejudice. My first job was sweeping up drywall dust at a construction site on East Riverside. $5 an hour, no benefits, no air conditioning. The foreman used to call me Mick, because he couldn't remember my name. One day I corrected him politely. He laughed and said, "Does it matter? You'll quit before payday." I didn't quit. I stayed until the building was finished, and they handed me the first check that ever had my full name printed on it. That was the start. Over the years I learned every trade on a site: framing, plumbing, electrical, roofing. My hands became maps of old cuts and burns. The skin thickened, but the pride underneath never did. By my mid-30s, I could build a house from the ground up without looking at a blueprint. That's when I met Margaret. She worked in accounting at a small local firm. Smart, gentle, fierce when it mattered. She had a laugh that could stop me mid-sentence. We married in 1986, and she taught me how to read balance sheets while I taught her how to hang drywall. We bought our first property together a year later. A cracked little duplex that smelled like mildew and hope. The bank almost didn't approve the loan. I still had calluses thicker than my credit score. But we fixed it up, painted it ourselves, rented it out, and made our first profit. Margaret said something then that stuck with me for the rest of my life. "Let success whisper, Jim. If you have to shout it, it's probably not real." For 35 years, that's how we lived. We never bragged. We drove used cars, bought Sarah's school clothes from Target, and kept our empire quiet. By 2018, Anderson Properties owned millions of square feet of office space. And yet I was still the man in jeans and a flannel shirt, patching fences on weekends. When Sarah was born, I promised her two things: that she'd grow up kind, and that she'd never have to measure her worth by someone else's bank account. She grew into everything we dreamed she'd be: bright, funny, and stubborn like her mother. Margaret passed 5 years ago, cancer. Quiet, unfair, brutal. Losing her felt like watching the scaffolding of my life collapse. For months I couldn't step into her office, the ledgers still open, her handwriting still on sticky notes. I kept her voice alive by replaying old voicemail messages, just to hear her call me love, in that calm way she did when the world felt too loud. Sarah and I got closer after that. We'd cook dinner together on Sundays, talk about her job at Dell, her plans, her friends. She once told me she was dating someone, a banker named Brandon Miller, and I remember the way her eyes sparkled when she said his name. That sparkle made me nervous. I've seen men like Brandon before. Polished smiles, hungry eyes, always looking over your shoulder at who's more important. The first time I met him, he showed up wearing a suit that cost more than my truck. He shook my hand like he was trying to measure my grip. Then he looked around our modest house. The worn leather couch, the old family photos, the smell of sawdust that never quite leaves a carpenter's home. "So, Mr. Anderson," he said, easing into my recliner like it belonged to him. "Sarah tells me you're retired from construction work." The way he said construction work made it sound like an infection. "Built houses for 35 years, I said. "Good, honest work." He nodded, a polite, pitying nod. "That's admirable. Manual labor keeps society running." Sarah caught my eye across the room. She knew that tone. The kind of tone that claps you on the back while looking down on you. That was the beginning. Over the next 2 years, Brandon made his disdain an art form. At family dinners, he'd talk about global markets and wealth strategies, pausing occasionally to explain terms as if I were a child. When I'd share stories from construction sites, the long nights pouring foundations or the time a hurricane almost tore apart a project we'd spent years building, he'd smile indulgently and change the subject. "Jim's old school," he'd tell Sarah's friends with a chuckle. He believes in blue-collar solutions. Never James. Never Dad. Just the construction guy. And slowly, Sarah started adjusting herself to fit his world. Dad, maybe wear the blue dress shirt instead of the flannel when Brandon's colleagues come over, she'd say softly. And maybe don't mention the duplex rentals, they might not understand. She didn't know those rentals had grown into skyscrapers. I stayed silent. Because silence had always protected me. From prejudice, from ego, from conflict. But silence can rot too if you hold it too long. At their engagement party, Brandon gave a speech in front of 200 people. I'm marrying into a humble working-class family, he said with a grin. It'll help me stay grounded. Laughter rolled through the crowd. I stood there, beer in hand, a museum exhibit of humility. He raised his glass toward me. My father-in-law taught me that honest work comes in many forms, even if it's not in a boardroom. The laughter turned polite. Controlled. Sarah smiled at him like he just quoted poetry. I smiled too, but my knuckles were white around that beer bottle. I could have stopped it right there. I could have told them the truth, that the simple man they were applauding owned the buildings they worked in. That Morgan Stanley, Brandon's firm, paid me over $2 million a year in rent. But Margaret's voice whispered again. Let success whisper, Jim. Let her build her own story. So I stayed quiet. For Sarah. For peace. For the illusion that love could soften arrogance. But silence isn't always kindness. Sometimes it's permission. The night of the wedding, that permission expired. The Fairmont Austin Hotel sparkled like money. 200 guests. Gold accents, white roses, the faint scent of champagne. Sarah looked radiant in her grandmother's pearls. I'd paid for everything. $85,000, every cent of it. Brandon's parents hadn't contributed a dime. From the corner of the room, I watched him glide from guest to guest, colleagues, bosses, partners. His charm filled the air like cologne. And every introduction started the same way. This is my wife, Sarah. She comes from a modest background, but she's driven. This is her father, simple man, salt of the earth. We're opposites, but opposites attract, right? Each sentence chipped a little deeper into me. Because I wasn't just hearing condescension, I was hearing my daughter's future being rewritten, one smug introduction at a time. Brandon didn't know the quiet man at the bar owned the building where his firm worked. He didn't know the rent checks he signed went straight to my company. He didn't know the ballroom he was standing in, the Fairmont Austin, was also mine. As I stood there nursing my whiskey, Margaret's voice echoed in my mind. If anyone ever disrespects our family, you show them who they're dealing with. I finished the drink, set the glass on the bar, and picked up my briefcase. Inside were the papers that told the real story of who I was, and who he'd underestimated. I looked across the room at my daughter, radiant, kind, proud, and made a decision. Because silence had been my strength for 40 years. But that night it would become my weapon. The ballroom shimmered like it had been dipped in gold. White roses glowed under chandeliers, linen napkins folded with military precision, champagne glasses catching the light like tiny suns. The string quartet was playing something soft and expensive, the kind of music people pretend to recognize. 200 people had come to celebrate my daughter's wedding. But as I stood near the bar, whiskey in hand, I didn't feel like part of it. I felt like I'd paid for a show and been cast as the background. $85,000. Every candle, every bouquet, every rented smile. All paid for by me. Brandon's parents had offered moral support instead of money. They claimed cash flow issues, which is what rich people call bad decisions. I wasn't angry about the money. I was angry about the way my daughter was slowly being erased by the man she'd chosen. From across the room, I watched her laugh politely as Brandon paraded her around like a trophy he'd bought with good taste. This is my wife, Sarah, he said again and again. She comes from a modest background, but she's driven. You can see why I fell for her. And then the kicker, always with that half smile. Her father's a simple man. Salt of the earth. Retired construction worker. We're total opposites, but hey, opposites attract, right? Every word landed like grit between my teeth. What he didn't realize, what no one in that room realized, was that the simple man leaning on the bar owned the ground beneath their designer shoes. I built this city's bones. I owned the office towers that touched its sky. I paid the salaries of the doormen who held the doors open for men like Brandon. And yet, standing there in my gray suit, people saw what they wanted to see. A quiet, unimportant man lucky to be invited to his daughter's big night. I wasn't angry because they were wrong. I was angry because I had let them be. The whiskey burned smooth going down, softening the ache in my chest. Margaret's voice echoed somewhere deep inside me. That calm, steel-lined whisper that had guided me for 30 years. If anyone ever disrespects our family, you show them who they're dealing with. I set the glass down, the ice clinking like a countdown, and reached for my briefcase. The leather was worn smooth at the handle, familiar, steady. Inside were the deeds, contracts, and business cards that told the real story of my life. Across the ballroom, Brandon was holding court near the champagne fountain, a gleaming thing made of glass and ego. 5 of his colleagues surrounded him, all men in tailored suits with watches that flashed like headlights. They were laughing, that sharp, polished laughter of people who believe they'll never be the punchline. I walked toward them. It felt like walking into a storm I'd been building for years. Brandon saw me coming. His smile faltered just enough for me to notice. Then he straightened, covering it with charm. "Dad," Sarah said quickly, appearing at my side, her voice tight. "Brandon's just talking shop." "That's all right," I said. "I'd like to introduce myself properly." Brandon chuckled. "Jim, we're discussing some complex financial instruments. Probably a bit over your head." The group laughed politely, a polite kind of cruelty. "Try me," I said. His eyebrows lifted, amused. "All right then. We're structuring a $400 million commercial real estate acquisition, multi-property portfolio, cross-market." "Interesting," I said. "What's the cap rate?" He blinked. "Excuse me." "Capitalization rate," I said evenly. "Net operating income divided by property value. Basic metric." A younger analyst beside him looked at me, surprised. 6.2%, he said. "Good yield for Austin," I replied. "Class A or B?" Brandon's jaw tightened. "Mostly Class A. Downtown core." He hesitated. "Some." "Why?" "I know that market well," I said. That line hit him. He smiled, but the edges were sharp. "Really? And how would a construction worker know commercial real estate metrics?" I could have laughed. Instead, I said, "You'd be surprised what you learn after building them for 35 years. The group went quiet. Patricia Wells, sharp-eyed, mid-50s, the kind of woman who could read a balance sheet like a confession, tilted her head. Brandon forced a laugh. "Maybe you can give us investment advice, Jim. Tell us which buildings to buy next." He was trying to make me small in front of them. I opened my briefcase, pulled out a business card, and handed it to him. "You might want to look into Anderson Properties," I said. He took it lazily, still smirking. "Never heard of them. They own some interesting assets downtown." "Like what?" "Office buildings," I said. 38 of them." He glanced down at the card and froze. For a heartbeat, the noise of the ballroom seemed to vanish. He read the name once, then again. "James Anderson, CEO, Anderson Properties LLC." Patricia's head snapped up. "Anderson Properties," she said. "You mean the Anderson Properties that own the Austin Financial Center and 221 West 6th? "That's right," I said quietly. Her eyes widened. "We've been trying to meet with your company for months. You own half the spaces we lease in this city." The young analyst looked at Brandon, then at me, then back again, trying to process the shift in gravity. Brandon swallowed. "You're your Anderson Properties?" "I was a construction worker," I said. "Then I started buying the buildings I helped build." Patricia straightened her jacket. "Mr. Anderson, I believe our firm manages some of your accounts." "That's right," I said. "Since 2019. Brandon said nothing. His hand trembled slightly around the business card. "Nice party," I said, closing the briefcase. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." And then I walked away. I spent the next half hour watching the ripples move through the room. Whispers travel faster than champagne bubbles. You could see it in the way people looked at him, not cruel but curious. The young banker who'd been lecturing the simple father-in-law about success had just discovered that his humble family owned his office. I didn't smile. Not yet. There was a quiet satisfaction, yes, but also a sadness. Because I knew Sarah was about to learn the hardest lesson of her life. That love built on arrogance collapses like bad scaffolding. Brandon didn't speak to me again during dinner. He spent most of the meal on his phone, typing furiously. Probably Googling my company, looking for proof that I was bluffing. But Anderson Properties doesn't advertise. We're invisible by design, private filings, no public bios, no social media. Margaret always said, let success be the thing people notice when they try to ignore you. By dessert, I could feel his frustration simmering. The guests chatted, the band played Sinatra, and Brandon drank like a man trying to refill his confidence. Every refill dulled his reason and sharpened his anger. When the toasts began, I felt the tension in my gut, that instinct that comes from years on construction sites, when you can sense the beam's about to give before it creaks. The best man finished his speech. The applause faded. The string quartet paused to retune their instruments. And that's when Brandon rose, glass in hand, tapping it with his knife. The soft ting-ting-ting echoed through the ballroom like the start of a warning bell. Ladies and gentlemen, he called out, swaying slightly. I want to say a few words about family. The crowd turned toward him, polite smiles ready. Sarah looked pale, almost pleading. I felt that same knot twist in my stomach, the same one I'd felt decades ago before a building collapse, when you just know something irreversible is about to happen. When I met Sarah, he began, I was struck by her determination to rise above her circumstances. He gestured toward our table. She comes from humble beginnings. Her father worked construction. A man of the people. A ripple of polite laughter. Now Jim's been telling my colleagues tonight about some property company he supposedly owns. Anderson Properties, was it? He smirked. It's a cute story. A little fairy tale for the evening. The air left my lungs. But that's what makes America great, right? He continued, voice rising. Anyone can dream. Even if those dreams are a little exaggerated. Sarah stood suddenly. Brandon, stop. No, sweetheart, he said, waving her off. This is important. Respect has to be earned. You don't earn it by pretending to be something you're not. I felt the room freeze, 180 people, every breath caught in collective disbelief. And that's when I stood up. The scraping of my chair against the marble floor cut through the silence. I picked up my briefcase and walked toward the microphone. Each step sounded louder than the last. Brandon's smile wavered. He didn't move. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. I reached the head table, looked him in the eye and said, You're right about one thing, Brandon. Respect does have to be earned. He smirked, relief flickering, thinking I was about to surrender. But he was wrong. Dead wrong. The air in that ballroom changed before I even touched the microphone. You could feel it, the weight of 100 people realizing something real was about to happen. The kind of silence that settles before a storm. Brandon stepped aside, still wearing his smirk, the drunk kind of confidence that thinks it's invincible. His tie hung loose, his glass was half empty, and his eyes glowed with the arrogance of a man who believed the moment belonged to him. I rested my briefcase on the head table. It made a small thud, heavy, deliberate. Then I looked out across the room. All that gold, all those roses, all those expensive smiles. People dressed like money, holding their breaths like debtors. Brandon's right. I began, my voice calm, steady. Respect does have to be earned. A few heads turned. A waiter froze mid-step. Sarah's eyes glistened in the candlelight. Her hand trembled around her glass. I took a slow breath. He's also right that I worked construction for 35 years. Brandon exhaled sharply, a victorious grin tugging at his lips. But maybe what he doesn't understand, I continued, is that honest work is the foundation on which every skyscraper stands. A ripple of murmurs drifted through the room. I built houses, schools, office towers, I said, my voice warming. I've poured foundations under the feet of men who never bothered to look down and see who made their comfort possible. I let the words breathe, slow, quiet, dangerous. Then I opened my briefcase. Inside was a manila folder, thick, organized, decades of my life pressed into paper. I laid it on the podium, flipped it open, and pulled out a stack of documents. These are property deeds, I said evenly. 38 of them. All in downtown Austin. Gasps rippled across the tables. Chairs shifted. Someone whispered, "No way." I flipped to the first page, the topmost sheet labeled Austin Financial Center. Total portfolio value based on current appraisals, I said, is approximately $1.4 billion. You could have heard a pin drop. I did start as a construction worker, I said. But eventually I started buying the buildings I built. One duplex in 1987 turned into 1,000 apartments. Then an office. Then another. 36 years later, Anderson Properties employs more people than any firm Brandon's ever worked for. I turned toward him slowly. His face was bloodless. "Your father-in-law isn't pretending, Brandon," I said quietly. "He's just been working while you were talking." A sharp inhale rolled through the crowd. Patricia Wells, sharp-suited, clear-eyed, the senior managing director from Morgan Stanley, stood slowly. "Wait," she said, her voice careful. "Anderson Properties?" "Yes, ma'am," I said. Her eyes widened. "We've been trying to schedule a meeting with your company for 6 months. You own half the buildings we lease in this city." The entire table of bankers turned toward Brandon like a pack of wolves, suddenly unsure who the alpha was. Brandon's hand tightened around his champagne glass until his knuckles whitened. He looked down at the tablecloth, his lips moving but no sound coming out. I reached back into the briefcase and pulled out another document, a contract printed on thick white paper. "This," I said, raising it, "is the lease agreement for 221 West 6th Street. Morgan Stanley Private Wealth's Austin office." Patricia blinked. "That's our building." "Rent," I continued, $2.3 million a year. Paid directly to Anderson Properties. I paused, then looked at Brandon. "Tenant manager, Brandon Miller." The sound that followed wasn't laughter, not yet. It was shock, gasps, stifled coughs, silverware clinking nervously. Brandon's glass slipped from his hand and shattered against the marble. Champagne sprayed across the tablecloth, sparkling like tiny shards of humiliation. Patricia straightened, professional instinct taking over. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice clear, "Mr. Anderson is one of our firm's largest private clients. His company owns a majority of the downtown real estate portfolio we operate in." That was when the applause began, hesitant at first, then growing, rolling like thunder against the high ceilings. Brandon stared at me, shaking his head. No, you're lying. This is fake. You forged this." I met his eyes, steady, unblinking. "Brandon, if you'd ever bothered to ask about me instead of talking over me, you'd know the truth doesn't need to shout." Patricia frowned and pulled her phone from her clutch. "Actually," she said, "let's confirm." She pressed a button, put it on speaker and said, "Anderson Properties emergency line, please." After 2 rings, a calm female voice answered, "This is Jennifer, Anderson Properties." "Hi, Jennifer," Patricia said. "This is Patricia Wells from Morgan Stanley. I'm here with Mr. James Anderson. Could you confirm his position?" "Of course, Ms. Wells," the voice said. "Mr. Anderson is the founder and CEO of Anderson Properties, LLC. He established the company in 1987. The firm currently owns and manages 38 properties in the downtown Austin area, valued at approximately $1.4 billion. A collective exhale swept the ballroom. "Thank you," Patricia said, ending the call. Brandon's lips parted, but no sound came out. His face had gone from pale to crimson. His eyes darted wildly, searching for an exit that didn't exist. Sarah was crying, silent tears that caught in the light like glass. She wasn't just embarrassed. She was realizing the full weight of what her husband had done, and what he'd almost made her become. I turned to the microphone again, my voice low. "Brandon was right about one thing," I said. "We should all know our place in the world." I stepped closer, close enough that only he could hear the next part. "Your place, son, has been in my building this whole time, paying me rent." And then softly into the microphone. "Respect isn't inherited. It's earned. And tonight you just lost it." The laughter that followed was different this time. Not cruel but liberating, like a room full of people realizing they'd been holding their breath too long. Patricia clapped first, then the rest followed. Some stood. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Even the band stopped pretending to tune their instruments and just watched. Brandon's hands trembled as he tried to collect himself. He reached for another glass, found none, and finally stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a chair. "Sarah, let's go," he hissed. "We're leaving." But she didn't move. Her face was streaked with tears, but her voice was calm. "I'm staying," she said. He froze. "What?" I said, "I'm staying." Her tone carried something he'd never heard before, self-respect. It hit him harder than my words ever could. He stared at her for a long, dangerous second, then turned and pushed through the doors, his footsteps echoing across the marble floor like the end of a rain. When the doors closed behind him, the room exhaled again. Someone cheered softly. Patricia came over, placed a hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "That may have been the most satisfying due diligence I've ever witnessed." I laughed, the first real laugh I'd had in years. "Glad to be of service," I said. I looked toward Sarah. Her shoulders were shaking, but not from shame. When she finally met my eyes, she whispered, "Dad, I'm so sorry." I walked over, pulled her into my arms and said, "You have nothing to be sorry for. Love can blind us, but it doesn't have to bury us." We stood there for a long moment. The room moved around us, waiters clearing glasses, guests whispering, music starting again. But for me, time had stopped. It wasn't triumph I felt. It wasn't revenge. It was relief. Because after 2 years of watching my daughter shrink under someone else's arrogance, she was standing tall again. That night, as the last guests drifted out and the chandeliers dimmed, I stayed behind for a while. I walked the empty ballroom floor, the echo of my boots blending with the faint hum of air conditioning. In the corner, the shattered glass still glistened under the light, a small monument to everything that had just broken and everything that might finally heal. I picked up one shard and held it against the light. It caught a reflection of me, older, lined but unbowed. Margaret's voice came back again, warm and soft. "If anyone ever disrespects our family, you show them who you are." "I did, love," I whispered. "And I showed him who Sarah is too." Outside, Austin's skyline shimmered against the night sky, my skyline. Each building stood tall and silent, the way I'd built it, not to shout but to last. And somewhere between those steel towers and that quiet Texas sky, I knew this chapter wasn't over. Humiliation breeds rage, and men like Brandon don't disappear quietly. But whatever came next, I was ready. Because this time I wasn't just fighting for respect. I was protecting legacy. For a long moment after Brandon stormed out, no one moved. The ballroom lights shimmered off the marble floor, reflecting broken glass and half-finished champagne flutes. Somewhere, the band stopped mid-tune, the violin bow frozen above the strings. Sarah stood beside me, pale but steady, her hand still clutching the edge of the tablecloth as if to remind herself the world was real again. Then someone began clapping. Slow, hesitant, almost embarrassed but genuine. Patricia Wells. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the whole room was applauding. Not for spectacle, not for money, but for something everyone in that room secretly longed for. Truth delivered without apology. I didn't bow. I wasn't proud of what I'd done. I was just finished. The applause faded, replaced by the soft hum of whispered conversation. The string quartet, bless their professionalism, began to play again, quietly, reverently. The sound filled the cracks in the silence. I turned to Sarah. She looked at me, tears streaming freely now, and whispered, "Dad, I'm sorry. I let him talk about you like that." I thought. I put my hands on her shoulders. "Sarah, you don't have to apologize. You wanted to believe in someone. That's not weakness, that's love. But love without respect is just a slow kind of death." Her lips trembled, but she nodded. And in that moment I knew something in her had come back to life. We left the ballroom last. The air outside was thick with Texas heat, even past midnight. The city glowed, glass towers reflecting the moon, cars moving like veins of light through downtown. Sarah leaned against me as we waited for the valet. "I feel like I've been asleep for 2 years, she said. Then tonight, I told her, you finally woke up. When the car pulled up, the driver recognized me. An older man who'd worked the Fairmont for decades. "Mr. Anderson," he said, smiling. "Beautiful event tonight." "Thank you, Tom," I replied. Sarah turned surprised. You know him? Tom grinned. Your father's been coming here since before the hotel opened. Always kind to the staff. Best tipper in Austin. Brandon had spent the whole evening trying to impress executives. Meanwhile, the people who opened the doors already knew who I was. That's the thing about respect. You can't demand it. You earn it when no one's watching. 3 days later, the news reached me, quietly like all good karma does. Brandon Miller had been terminated from Morgan Stanley. Conduct unbecoming of an associate. The internal memo never mentioned the wedding, but everyone in his department knew. Patricia made sure of that. A week after that, I got a call from a compliance officer asking to verify my signature on the lease termination notice. I confirmed it. Politely. They thanked me for my cooperation. By Christmas, Brandon had vanished from Austin's financial circles. Rumor said he tried to start a boutique consulting firm in Dallas. It lasted 6 months. He called Sarah twice. She didn't answer either time. Sarah moved back in with me for a while. The first night I found her sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through old photo albums. Her makeup was gone, her hair pulled back, and she looked younger, like my little girl again. She laughed softly, pointing to one photo of us at a construction site. She must have been 7, maybe 8, wearing a yellow hard hat that was too big for her head. I told everyone in my class you built cities, she said. I did, I smiled. They just didn't believe you yet. We spent weeks rebuilding her confidence. We cooked, we watched old movies, we fixed the porch swing Margaret used to love. Some nights she cried without words. Some nights she laughed until she couldn't breathe. Both were good signs. Healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small, ordinary moments that don't make headlines. In quiet dinners and morning coffee and remembering how to breathe without apology. One afternoon, Sarah came into my study with a box. Inside were the gifts Brandon had given her. Jewelry, letters, receipts for designer bags. Tokens of affection that aged like milk. I want to sell them, she said. Why? Because they don't mean anything now. And I want to build something that does. That week, I helped her file paperwork for a small startup, Anderson Heritage, a boutique real estate firm specializing in restoring historical homes in Austin. She wanted to rebuild what arrogance had tried to destroy. The first property she bought was the same cracked duplex Margaret and I had purchased back in 1987. She painted it yellow. Months passed. Austin moved on. I didn't see Brandon again, not until almost a year later. It was late fall and I was attending a charity gala downtown. I just stepped outside for some air when I heard a voice behind me. Mr. Anderson. I turned. He looked older, thinner. His perfect hair was gone, replaced by a buzz cut that made his forehead look too large. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit, just a plain blazer slightly wrinkled. Brandon. I wanted to apologize, he said. His voice shook just a little. I've had time to think about what happened. I was drunk and stupid and arrogant. I didn't say anything. He continued. You were right. Respect isn't inherited. I learned that the hard way. I nodded. What are you doing now? Consulting, he said quietly. Trying to get back on my feet. I studied him for a long moment. Do you respect the people who work for you? He looked down. I try to. That's a start, I said and turned to go. Wait, he called after me. Do you hate me? I paused. No, I said. Hate's too expensive. I've learned to invest my time better. Then I walked away. A year later, Sarah married again. It wasn't a grand ballroom this time. Just a sunlit courtyard lined with oak trees, 80 guests, laughter that sounded like home. Her husband, David Wilson, was a software engineer who'd grown up in El Paso. He wasn't flashy, but he was kind. The kind of man who listens more than he talks. During his speech, he raised his glass and said, I'm not marrying into Sarah's family, I'm joining it. Because real wealth isn't what you have, it's who you learn from. I felt Margaret in that moment, not as a memory but as presence. Her lessons woven into our lives like invisible thread. After the ceremony, Sarah found me near the garden. You okay, Dad? I'm perfect, I said. You look like your mother today. She smiled. That's the best compliment you could give me. We stood together watching the sunset, and for the first time in a long time, everything felt complete. These days I still drive downtown every few weeks just to see the skyline at night. The city I helped build, one floor, one loan, one risk at a time. Sometimes I park across from the Fairmont Hotel and look up at the ballroom windows. They glow faintly, the ghosts of that night long gone but never forgotten. It's strange. That building used to feel like a battlefield. Now it just feels like proof. Proof that dignity doesn't shout. It endures. I've been asked a dozen times since then whether I regret how it all went down, the confrontation, the humiliation, the fallout. I don't. Not because I enjoyed it, but because silence had cost too much already. For decades, I let people assume things about me, about immigrants, about builders, about quiet men. And that's fine most of the time. Let them talk. But when their arrogance starts teaching the next generation to doubt their own worth, that's when you speak. If I hadn't said something that night, Sarah might have spent the rest of her life apologizing for her roots. Instead, she learned that humility doesn't mean submission. It means strength without noise. Last month, she invited me to tour a house she'd restored through Anderson Heritage. It was an old craftsman home, creaky floors, wide porch, the kind of place people drive past without noticing. She brought it back to life. Every beam straightened, every corner repainted with care. This was almost condemned, she said, pride shining through. Now it's someone's first home again. I looked at her, hands speckled with paint, face glowing with purpose. And for the first time since Margaret died, I thought, she's going to be just fine. We stood on that porch a long time, watching the city breathe. Sarah turned to me and asked, "Dad, do you ever miss building?" I smiled. "Every day." "But you don't do it anymore?" "Oh, I still build," I said. "I just build quieter things now, like people." She laughed. "You sound like Mom." "Good," I said. "That means I'm doing something right." So if you're listening to this story, whether you're a builder, a dreamer, or someone who's been looked down on for not fitting the mold, remember this. Power isn't in how loud you speak. It's in how solid you stand. Respect isn't a gift someone gives you. It's the echo your actions leave behind when the room goes silent. And if anyone ever underestimates you, don't rush to prove them wrong. Just keep building. Because one day they'll look up and realize the skyline they admire was yours all along. That's my legacy. That's my revenge. That's my peace.